Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know, being a landlord in Vancouver, sometimes it feels like everyone says it's so hard. You know what I mean?
I get it.
Like this is a big, huge challenge.
Yeah.
But are things maybe changing a little bit? Today, we're going to look at some new regulations that are coming out of BC and specifically focusing on Vancouver. And these changes are kind of being presented as possibly making it a bit easier to be a landlord.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of really interesting sources to kind of dig into today. First, we have a report from City News Vancouver that's detailing some of these new provincial government regulations, and they're using this language of loosening the rules.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting. But we also have this other article from Urbanized, and it's actually focusing on this specific case where a landlord was hit with some pretty hefty financial penalties for a bad faith eviction.
Okay, interesting.
So we're kind of looking at both sides of the coin here. You know, we have these potential changes that maybe could make things a little smoother, but then we also have this reminder that the rules that exist are still very serious, and there are some serious consequences if you don't follow them. So today we're going to try to understand exactly what these changes mean and what they could mean for you if you're out there and you're renting out property.
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting you say that because it's not like a secret that being a landlord in Vancouver is considered really challenging.
Right.
Like everyone's always talking about how expensive property management is, or, you know, just all the different needs that tenants have and all these legal requirements.
Absolutely.
So I think it's really interesting that maybe the province is trying to make it a little easier.
Yeah, I think the fact that these new regulations are even being introduced suggests that on some level, maybe there is this recognition, even if it's unspoken, that landlords face a lot of complexities. And when you see these changes that are aimed at, streamlining some processes or maybe even reducing some of the responsibilities of landlords, it suggests that maybe there's a shift happening in how we're thinking about this landlord-tenant relationship and maybe trying to make it a little bit more balanced.
That's interesting. Well, let's jump into these potential loosening of rules, as City News put it.
Okay.
What are some of the big changes that we should be aware of?
Okay, well, one of the first ones that really jumps out from this City News article is the change in the notice period that a landlord has to give when they want to take back a property for their own personal use.
Okay.
So right now it's 4 months, and starting in the summer of 2025, that's going to be reduced down to 3 months.
Oh, interesting. So a whole month less notice for the tenant.
Yeah.
What's the thinking behind that? Like, is it really just as simple as just shortening the time?
Well, the government's saying that they're doing this to kind of create more consistency. So they're aligning this change with a recent change that requires homebuyers who are planning to occupy the property to also give tenants 3 months notice.
Oh, interesting.
So it seems like they're trying to standardize things a little bit.
Okay.
And I guess you could also speculate that maybe this will help landlords to fill those vacancies a little quicker in those situations, so it might make the transition a little smoother.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So aligning those rules makes sense, I guess, on the surface. Now, the article also talked about some changes that are coming to the residential tenancy branch.
Yes.
What's happening there?
So it seems like there's a real push toward transparency. Starting next summer, so at the same time as the notice period change, the RTB is going to start making all of the monetary orders that come out of dispute resolution hearings public.
Whoa,
We're
okay.
told.
So like everyone can see.
Everyone will be able to see them.
Wow, okay.
And these orders, they cover all kinds of issues.
Okay.
So it could be things like, a tenant hasn't paid rent or hasn't paid utilities. It could also be, on the flip side, a landlord has done an illegal eviction or they haven't maintained the property to acceptable standards.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So these are all going to be public record.
Exactly.
What are they hoping that's going to do?
Well, the province is saying that they're hoping that this will help to create more consistency in how these kinds of disputes are resolved.
Okay.
So the idea is if people can see what's happened in past cases, then both landlords and tenants will have a better understanding of how their own situation might play out.
Okay.
So it's almost like setting a precedent.
Right.
And it could also act as kind of a deterrent,
Yeah.
If people know that these decisions are public, then they might be less likely to violate tenancy laws in the first place.
Right. It's like you're shining a light on the whole process.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about something that I think is a really practical issue for landlords, and that's abandoned property.
Right.
The article mentioned there's some changes there too, right?
Yes, there are some changes, and these ones actually came into effect pretty recently on April 9th of this year.
Oh, wow.
So there are two main changes. The first is that the minimum value of property that a landlord has to store if a tenant abandons it has been increased. So it used to be $500, now it's $1,000.
Okay.
And the second change is that the amount of time that landlords have to store abandoned property has been cut in half. So it used to be 60 days, and now it's only 30 days.
Okay, so less storage and for a shorter period of time.
Exactly, unless the stuff is worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like this is something that could really help landlords because I imagine dealing with abandoned property can be such a pain.
Yeah, I mean, just logistically and also financially, right?
Right.
If you have to store stuff for a long time, that can really add up, especially if it's not stuff that's worth very much.
Yeah, for sure.
So this definitely seems like it could take some of that pressure off.
Okay. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch on from this City News article is this big investment that the government's made into the residential tenancy branch.
Yes.
What's that about?
So they've put $15.6 million towards improving services at the RTB.
Wow.
Okay, yeah, it's a big chunk of change. And one of the main things they're focusing on is improving wait times for dispute resolution hearings.
Okay, good. Because I can imagine having to wait months to have a dispute resolved would be incredibly stressful.
Oh, absolutely. And it would be really expensive, too.
Yeah.
But it sounds like things are getting a lot better.
Sorry.
The article says that the average wait time now is about a month.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a huge difference.
It is, and the province is saying that this makes BC a leader in Canada in terms of how quickly these disputes are resolved.
That's great.
Yeah, and they're also creating all these new resources for landlords specifically.
Okay, like what?
So they're putting together these guides that are supposed to be really easy to understand on things like how to collect rent if a tenant isn't paying, how to navigate the eviction process, and they even have a toolkit that's designed to help landlords prepare for hearings.
I mean, anything that can make those processes a little bit easier to understand, I think is a good thing.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like the government's really making an effort here to address some of the challenges that landlords are facing and maybe make things run a little bit smoother.
I think so. I mean, that's definitely the message that's coming through in this City News article. But it's important to remember that even if some things are getting a bit easier, landlords still have to operate within the law.
Of course.
And they still have to follow all the rules.
Yeah.
And that's where this article from Urbanize comes in.
Right.
Because it provides this really important reminder that ignoring the rules can have some serious consequences.
Yeah, it sounds like this case is a good example of what can happen if you try to cut corners.
Yeah, for sure.
So what happened in this case?
Well, this was a landlord in East Vancouver, and they gave eviction notices to their tenants back in October of 2021. And there were actually two sets of tenants.
Okay.
And the landlord said that they were planning to demolish the house, and they gave them the required 4 months notice.
Right.
So the tenants, they moved out in February of 2022.
Okay.
But instead of demolishing the house, the landlord ended up renting it out to new tenants just 3 months later.
Oh, wow. So they never actually demolished it?
Nope.
Okay, so what happened next?
Well, the original tenants found out what happened, and they filed a complaint with the residential tenancy branch.
He must have been so upset.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
And they argued that they had been evicted in bad faith?
Right, because the landlord wasn't actually planning to demolish the house?
Exactly.
Okay.
And the RTB agreed with the tenants.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And they ordered the landlord to pay each of the tenancies 12 months of rent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that worked out to $17,000 for the tenants who lived in the basement.
Okay.
And $26,000 for the tenants who lived on the main floor. So it was a pretty big financial hit for the landlord.
$43,000.
Yeah, $43,000 in total.
Wow.
But the landlord wasn't happy with that decision.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So they appealed to the BC Supreme Court.
Okay.
And they argued that they had been going through some marital problems and that this had caused them to change their plans for the property.
Okay.
So they were basically trying to say that they hadn't been deliberately dishonest in the beginning,
Okay.
but the judge wasn't convinced. And it turned out that the landlord had made a really big mistake.
What was that?
They had applied for some permits for the property,
Okay.
and they had even gotten some of them approved,
Okay.
but they never actually got a demolition permit.
Oh. Oh.
Yeah.
So they told the tenants they were going to demolish the house, but they never even had permission to do that.
Exactly.
Oh, my God.
And that's a big no-no.
Right.
You can't evict tenants for demolition unless you actually have a permit to demolish the building.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happened?
So the judge upheld the RTB's decision.
Okay.
And they dismissed the landlord's appeal.
Wow.
And on top of the $43,000, the landlord also had to pay the tenant's legal fees.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
So this turned out to be a very expensive mistake.
Yeah, a very expensive mistake. And I think it really highlights how important it is for landlords to do things by the book.
Yeah.
Even if some rules are being relaxed, you can't just ignore the ones that are still in place.
Right.
So even though the province might be trying to make some things easier for landlords, things like evictions are still taken very seriously.
Absolutely.
And the RTB and the courts, and they're there to make sure that everyone is treated fairly and that landlords are following the law.
Right. So it's kind of like a two-sided story here, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, we have the government making these changes that could potentially make some parts of being a landlord a bit less of a hassle. Like, having to give less notice in certain situations or not having to store abandoned property for as long.
Right.
And it sounds like the changes at the RTB might help to resolve disputes faster, which is good for everyone.
Absolutely. And it seems like the overall goal is just to reduce the burden on landlords.
Right. But on the other hand, we have this case that shows just how important it is to follow the rules.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Just because some rules are being relaxed doesn't mean landlords can disregard the ones that are still in place.
Right. It's about understanding the nuances.
Yeah.
Some things might be getting a little easier, but there's still a lot of responsibilities that come with being a landlord.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways here? What should our listeners keep in mind?
I think there are two main things to remember. The first is to be aware of these changes that are coming up, like the new notice periods, the changes to the RTB, and the new rules around abandoned property.
Okay.
These are all things that could potentially make life a little bit easier for landlords. But the second thing, and this is really important, is to remember that landlords still have to act in good faith, and they still have to follow the law.
Right.
Those core responsibilities haven't changed. And as we saw in that case that we talked about, the consequences for not following the rules can be very, very serious.
Right. So I guess it's about understanding that even though things might be getting easier in some ways, in other ways, it's just as important as ever to be careful and make sure you're doing everything by the book.
Exactly.
So here's a final thought for you all to consider. With these changes that are happening and the legal framework that's already in place, how do you think being a landlord in Vancouver will change in the next few years? Will it actually get easier overall, or is that just wishful thinking?
Yeah.
And what are the responsibilities that will always be there no matter what? I think these are all important questions to consider as you navigate the world of being a landlord. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.